AM2R, the fan remake of Metroid 2 and my first visit in years to the Metroid series, ever since being scared of the first level of Metroid Prime and screwing around on Metroid Prime Hunters. Of the three games, this is the one I spent the most time with and is hands down the best of the three. I don't know too much, if anything, about this game's development, but by God, they did a fantastic job with this game. It's beautiful. The sprites are wonderfully animated with lots of small touches, Samus herself in particular with all their idle animations, and visually, the world of AM2R pops out at the eye, with each area having its own distinct look and feel, and the soundtrack, oh my God, this soundtrack is wonderful. It perfectly lends itself to the atmosphere of this alien world and is an absolute joy to listen to. The best comparison I can personally make towards the gameplay is with either Dust and Elysian Tale or Mighty No. 9. Reason being that, like in Mighty No. 9 or Mega Man if you prefer, very early on you have to rely on jumping to assist with the precision of your shots in order to take out certain enemies, something that isn't too stressful thanks to the blessing of 8-directional shooting, giving you good maneuverability when you go up against the game's solid enemy variety, and that's without taking into account the various weapon upgrades you acquire. But in the case of Dust, it's because this is Metroidvania in the truest sense. I was receiving a steady stream of upgrades and new abilities as reward for my exploration of the world, which in turn allowed me access to new areas and shortcuts, unlike Dust, which was linear. I was required to return to certain areas with my new abilities in order to move forward, and not just for optional challenges and secrets, something that put a genuine smile on my face. Granted, I was left stumped a couple times when I encountered walls that could only be destroyed using a certain attack, usually one I didn't have, and I was left to experiment with trial and error to move past these. But that was only a minor inconvenience at most, and worked as a curious incentive to explore and find new abilities and upgrades. But what wasn't a minor inconvenience was how, as I progressed, I was slowly being reminded of Dark Souls, and not in a good way. I get that older games, particularly those made back when I was too young and stupid to know they existed, were a lot harder than the mainstream stuff made these days. But Jesus Christ on a stick! Did this game get unnecessarily hard at times? Some enemies can be annoyingly persistent, and some of the later Metroid boss fights, they can become a real chore once the joy of their challenge wears off. A notable example is the fight with the statue robot. At first, it's just a decently challenging battle, but when it goes into its second form, oh boy. It suddenly becomes a trial by fire, forcing you to learn how to use a newly acquired ability, something that you've had no experience with prior to the fight. It doesn't help that the invincibility frames are just crap. Get hit, you get the frames, but only for a second and a half, then you go back to taking damage, something that made me rage quit this game quite a few times. But then again, these are just issues that could be resolved with a patch, but since the devs were DMCA'd by Nintendo, I don't see that happening, unless another fan or one of the devs does it anonymously. If you're a fan of Metroid, you really need to give this remake a go. Even though Nintendo took it down, it's still real easy to get your hands on. Just type in AM2R into Google and you're sure to find it. But if you're a newcomer like me, I'd recommend something similar in design like Dust or one of the earlier Metroids, just at least to get an idea of what to expect before going into this. Now, on to the next game of this indie showcase, Kholat. Now, by far, this was the most disappointing of the games I played. I got it as part of the Survival Humble Bundle, so naturally I was expecting a narratively driven experience, similar to, say, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, with some survival elements thrown in. And that is not what I got by any stretch of the imagination. Interestingly enough, this game is actually based on a true tragedy. During the 1950s, there was a group of Russian university students who went up to the Kholat mountains as part of their studies, but never came down. A search party did find their remains, but they were scattered in a way that indicated that they were panicking and pursued before they died, leaving investigators stumped as to what actually happened. And in this game, you play as an investigator trying to get to the bottom of what really happened once and for all. Despite its best efforts, the game's story doesn't do a good job at all of drawing in player investment, largely due to the fact that the story is primarily told through text logs you find scattered in the overworld, or through Sean Bean narrating the protagonist's thoughts.
A makeshift campfire suggested they tried to warm up, The bodies were only in underwear. I decided to thoroughly search the area between the tent and the tree line.
Despite some initial direction, you're just left to wander the Kholat Mountains trying to piece together the story, and you do this either by looking for a far-off landmark and figuring out the path there, or checking your map and trying to figure out where you are in relation to a set of coordinates.
Or just the opposite.
I have seen this style of game design work before, again, the vanishing of Ethan Carter, but the key difference is that in Ethan Carter, you saw a landmark, and as you made your way there, you'd wander into different puzzles or events that would lead to a narrative payoff. And that was before even getting to the puzzles at the landmarks. But in Kholat, it goes like this. See a landmark, wander over to it, realize the path is twisted, find the right way there, and then have a narrative moment that pays off with a text log. However, these narrative moments are actually pretty engaging, and they are set up in a way that does evoke genuine dread and tension, and the story of the students can be intriguing at times and does make for some decent world building. But they're just too few and far between in an experience that's primarily made up of walking across a large landscape. You can fast travel between campsites for the sake of expedience, but that only cuts down your wandering depending on where you intend to go. The wandering would have been much more engaging if instead of just curiosity driving me forward, there were, as the Humble Bundle led me to believe, survival elements to this, like looking for food to keep hunger at bay and maintain a brisk pace, or have the different areas of the Kholat Mountains affect my body heat to different degrees, thus creating a need to find different sources of heat to maintain warmth. But nope, all we get is some area exclusive hazards and, of course, these monsters. The monsters in the game are the only real persistent survival hazard, and for the most part their AI is pitifully stupid and real easy to avoid. But they can be a genuine threat at times, and at that point your only option is to just run away. But unfortunately, the protagonist is really out of shape for someone exploring a mountain range, and can't run more than 5 meters before needing to stop and take a breather. Oh, on that note, when you die, the first person death animation is actually kinda funny just for how silly it looks. Overall, Kholat really didn't resonate with me. The interesting moments were too few and were padded with either near aimless wandering, hiding from the not scary monsters, or just looking for pieces of paper. Its poor performance on my laptop certainly didn't help either. Hell, the only time I ever got a smooth frame rate was whenever I was at the central area and looking at the ground. Is it a bad game though? No. My biggest problems just stem from how I was misled by the Humble Bundle it came with, and there are times where the story can draw you in. If you're curious, it is worth a look, but you're really not missing out on much if you pass it over. Now that that's out of the way, on to the last game. This book is a dungeon. My unintended second trip into the world of text adventures. Really, I had no idea this was a text adventure going into it. I thought it was a dungeon crawling RPG with a text-based interface. Anyway, of the three, this is the game I actually spent the least time with, but that had less to do with it being a bad game and more to do with the increasing evidence that text adventures, they just don't resonate with me. For those who don't know, my only experience with text adventures before this was with the melancholic turd known as Depression Quest. And the one thing this game easily trumps that turd in is storytelling, mainly because there actually is a story being told. You're playing as a recently diagnosed as terminally ill version of yourself who finds a mysterious book on a train, and after opening it, you find yourself trapped in a horrific dungeon where crawling terrors, mad tormentors, and eldritch horrors stalk the shadows. And best of all, the writing, it's actually up to snuff. There were times where I was sincerely drawn into the story, and there's even a library area with short stories that are enjoyable to read. A personal favourite of mine was The Woman Who Survived the Blizzard. But while the writing is good, where the game stumbles is in pretty much every other category. The puzzles are interesting at first, but once you realise that one slip up thanks to trial and error means death, and that means restarting the chapter from the beginning, you'd be forgiven for getting pissed off. It would have been more tolerable if the game employed midway checkpoints so you wouldn't have to redo all the puzzles in a chapter upon failure. Hell, combat is quite possibly the worst aspect of this game. Yeah, you heard me right. This game has combat. Turn-based combat that reminds me of Pokemon of all things. But its problem is that all you're doing is clicking on the attack command, waiting to see if it hits, wait to see if the enemy hit you, and then rinse and repeat until either you or the enemy is dead. The growing monotony of having to redo entire chapters and the one-dimensional combat would be more bearable if the soundtrack was good, but this game doesn't even have one. It's just pure silence. Hell, the music you're hearing right now, that's actually just an MP3 I put in just so there wouldn't be mute footage under me. Hell, give Depression Quest some credit, at least it actually had a soundtrack, even if it was just the same brief piano score on an endless loop. Sure, there are changes to the game's interface based on narrative events, and they do create some atmosphere and tension, as well as some relief from possible eye strain, but it isn't enough. A soundtrack that would change with the interface changes really would have made for a more compelling experience. Every time I play one of these, it becomes more apparent that I'm not the right person for text adventures. But unlike Depression Quest, which nearly succeeded in putting me off the genre, this Book is a Dungeon has restored some curiosity for it. I can't recommend this to anyone for the story alone, but if nobody else, I can recommend it to fans of text adventures. If you like these games, then give this Book is a Dungeon a go, but everyone else, just stick to what you're already playing. Hey, thanks for checking out this video, really appreciate it. If you really like this video, how about you check out some of my other game reviews, or maybe some movie reviews, or any of the other stuff I've got up on here. And for next month, because it's going to be October, the month of horror, I'm going to be focusing most of my gaming videos, and probably some of my movie reviews, on horror. I'm going to be doing a brief Let's Play of Alien Isolation, a review of Killer 7, which is just freaky, and possibly a review of either Forbidden Siren 1 or Forbidden Siren 2, depending on which one I can get working. Anyway, stay tuned for that, and don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe.